get to meet some folks in the community, and really good to get a chance to share my story with you folks today. All right, so we ready to kick off?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. So talking today about decisions, debt, and other dilemmas. Now, I used to be a product manager like all of you here today. And I used to ask all the usual product manager questions like, what problem are you trying to solve? And how might we solve that? Or how might we discover more about that? And the ultimate product manager question, have you tried turning it off and back on again? I was one of those product managers who built their own things. So I'm a CEO now, as my own thing turned into ProdPad. As you just heard from my warm welcome, you also might know me as one of the founders of Mind the Product. And I've also been a product consultant, a trainer, and a mentor, and all sorts along the way. I'm going to be around all day, all this afternoon to answer your questions, and I'm happy to chat about product with you if you reach out to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, email, or wherever you happen to find me. I'm friendly and always happy to chat. I've also posted my slides and notes so you can have them for keeping or for sharing later. Now, these roles have given me different lenses on the world. Being a CEO gives me a particular lens that I obsess about. Debt. Now, debt is an uncomfortable topic. No one likes talking about their financial failings. It can break up families and friendships. Likewise, debt in your working life can cause tension and storming, breaking teams and builds. Debt is uncomfortable to talk about. Are we uncomfortable yet? Because we're going to talk about it, and we're really going to look at where it comes from. But we're going to talk about how we use it to our advantage, too. Our world is filled with making decisions, and making decisions means making trade-offs. Building a product is a multi-dimensional problem. It can't be done without making trade-offs, the same way you can't get through life without making trade-offs. Like most of us can't get through life without going into some sort of debt. Getting a mortgage, an education, a car, all mean some sort of financial debt usually. You could try to save up some of the cash ahead of time, but you'd likely be dead before you saved enough. Just like you could imagine trying to build the perfect product, allowing no debt before it goes out the door, but it'd be obsolete before it was launched. Now, you might be familiar with the iron triangle of time, cost, scope, and quality. For any one of these factors to give, you've got to be willing to give on another front. We rarely have spare budget or all the time in the world to play with, so time or cost is often flexed in exchange for scope or quality. And this is exactly what we're doing when we run experiments. Using quick prototypes and MVPs, we're trading off perfect quality or full scope to gain back a chunk of time and cost. But that approach isn't sustainable forever. You know the saying, good, fast, cheap, pick two. If you always optimize for speed and short-term cost savings, you'll never actually have a stable and usable product. Making these trade-offs and taking on debt is okay and healthy if it's understood and managed, but it can also get out of hand. So let's talk about tech debt. No one likes tech debt, but it's a reality of your product's life. And by tech debt, I mean the bugs or limitations that are built into your product's code, or really the cost of reworking existing parts of your product that were built in a hasty or subpar way instead of the full and ideal solution that you would have wanted. Like financial debt, you might find that some tech debt is intentional. After all, your team can't be expected to build the most perfect, most scalable version of the product from day one. You might agree to take on tech debt as trade-off so you can learn fast from an experiment. This is fine if the team knows what's at stake and how the tech debt's going to be measured and managed. Other tech debt is unintentional. It comes about when you don't have these conversations with your team and there's not a shared understanding of how the product is meant to be built or how the whole company as a whole wants to deal with tech debt. Because while intentional tech debt might come from smart trade-offs, unintentional tech debt usually comes from beyond the tech team's control. I blame deadlines. Now, sometimes deadlines are necessary, and I'm not saying we should never work to them. I am saying that we should ditch the timeline roadmap. Your bosses and your customers love this format of a roadmap, right? It gives them so much certainty of what's going to be done and when. But it's setting your team up for failure, and it's basically a tech debt collection pot. See, if you deconstruct this format of the roadmap, you basically get a chart that maps out time versus things to do. You have time on the x-axis, creating this timeline. And at first, it seems pretty harmless, especially in the short term. But the further out you plan and the more you put on there, the harder it becomes to manage. And because that timeline sits at the top, always marching forward, no matter what you put on the roadmap, everything includes a deadline. And this is where the problems start happening. Try as we might to add enough buffer and breathing room to our timelines. When you've got that many things going on, two things are bound to happen. First of all, you might be familiar with Parkinson's law, if not by name, at least by concept. It's the one that states that work expands to fill the time given for that work. So no matter how much buffer you're adding to your timelines, you always seem to be cutting it close. Scope always creeps, and other things always cut in. Which means that your team finds themselves up against a deadline crunch way more often than you'd like. And you're forced to make a trade-off. You're no longer making an informed decision about a reduced scope or time-limited experiment, but instead you're making last-minute adjustments to the plan to take out features or to lob more resources at the work or to get the job done. But the real damage is done underneath the surface, where the product manager often doesn't even realize. Code that could have been more elegant, more readable, more performant just isn't built. And instead, a more rushed version goes live. Comments and documentation are left by the wayside. Your release might look like it meets all the requirements, but underneath, it's just that little bit subpar. You've accrued some new tech debt. And sometimes these deadlines come in wave after wave as each sprint is marched out the door. It causes team stress. Developers ditch their jobs, and then you're left with a pile of junk for a code base, and there's no one on the team who's left to fix it, leaving you with a costly refactor every couple of years. And refactors are the worst. Keep following this cycle, and a few botched refactors in, and you'll find yourself technically bankrupt. But it turns out you can mitigate this issue. It wouldn't be a problem with better communication and if there's a plan to get back to that project and fix it up. But everyone knows that V2 is the biggest lie that your roadmap ever told. So instead of a timeline and a bunch of arbitrary deadlines, give your developers an understanding of your company goals, whether that's OKRs or something else. Include them in the speccing process early so they can help drive towards the right outcomes, and give them the time and space to deliver code that they'd actually be proud to support. Our rubric here at ProdPad is build this as if you're the one who's going to be training a junior developer on how to use your code and docs in a couple years' time. It sometimes means a couple more days in delivery to get the final output up to scratch, but the devs are as bought into the company goals as the next person, and don't get stuck in rabbit holes or lose focus. As a result, we get a great mix of stable code and regular releases. Underpinning all of this at its heart is a big element of trust in your development team. Now we're going to come back to this point. It's not just tech debt. that a product manager needs to worry about. Design debt is made up of the limitations that are built into the product that aren't down to a bug or not working as designed, but rather the design not matching the actual user requirement down the line. It can be found amongst the calls of, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Design debt is sometimes even more insidious than tech debt because you're less likely to have a plan for it. Companies are more likely to have a plan for paying down tech debt, like having bug crush weeks or allotting a certain amount of time to refactoring technical work. But we don't seem to have a collective vocabulary around the concept of design debt. And like tech debt, design debt can stack up. Now, you can't improve what you can't measure. So a good starting point is having a way to measure and understand the design debt in your product. Our product designer, Cav, came up with a way of measuring design debt that I found really helpful. He sets up a usability test that's focused on core jobs we expect users to want to do. Users are marked on their ability to complete the job, with bright green if they completed the task without help, light green or yellow if they struggled a little or a lot, and a red mark if they couldn't get the job done. And the changes over time gives guidance on where to focus to pay down design debt and increase usability across the product. Improvements can be visualized across each iteration. As product people, we want to be able to iterate and release quickly, to experiment freely and learn as much as possible in as short a time as possible. An MVP is really nothing more than reducing scope in order to get something in front of the market faster and cheaper. Ideally, experiments are digested for their lessons and then put to bed. But good experiments are still costly and time-consuming to run. And let's not talk about what goes into building fully stable features. Corners do tend to get cut, and we often end up with a product that's been patched together out of past MVPs and experiments and is hardly a delight to anyone. Using a design system can help here. Now, these are often thought of something fanciful and are rarely thought of as a priority investment. But just as proper tools and a stable code base are important to the tech team, having a design system is an important ingredient for a company that wants to avoid design debt. A design system provides a baseline so that experiments and new features can be spun up with less of a trade-off on time. Or if that's got to give, less of a trade-off on quality. If tech debt and design debt aren't kept in check, then they spill over. Your company's processes should help support your product's experiences. But where you've got lots of tech and design debt stacked up, you'll find that you end up over-relying on humans to make up the shortfall. For example, if a section of your app is particularly unusable, your support team will be picking up the slack and spending more time on inbound tickets. They might need to write better help docs to compensate for usability issues that should have just been intuitive in the app itself. You might find yourself with a bunch of shaky automations and manual processes instead of solid tech holding your services together. Sometimes unscalable processes are perfectly appropriate. In fact, these are key to learning, just as any experimentation is. It depends on your stage of your company and what your ultimate goals are. But left untended, it can be costly. It's not uncommon for processes to be put in place and then forgotten about. Again, it's important to measure. You can measure the cost to serve figure, as in how much it's costing each person to do a function and for how much of their time. You can look in support tools like Zendesk for stats on which areas of the app are resulting in the most tickets, or what search queries are being plugged into your help center, or spot influxes and blips in support, all of which might point to and be alleviated by paying down tech or design debt. Product decisions should be done by looking at these sorts of things holistically, not just at user pains in the app, but at costly business pains that might be hidden behind the scenes in bloated processes. And sometimes debt goes entirely unchecked at companies, and this comes at a real cost. Managing debt well seems to be a bit of a mindset thing for companies. Some think holistically about the state of their products and services and build for the long term, while others seem to really suffer from short termism, an attitude of collecting debt left, right, and center with no concern for the racking up of costs. So, what's going on at these companies? As with many things, it comes down to incentives. Companies in particular, like your large and public ones, want to increase shareholder value. CEOs are incentivized to show quarter on quarter steady growth. And if they don't, they're turfed. Management wants to show predictable growth for fear of spooking investors. And the best route to predictability is to break the business up and look at it in smaller, more manageable chunks. And this sort of makes sense too, except it basically leaves you with silos, which leads us into dangerous territory where vanity metrics rule. Divisions find themselves competing to max out their own metrics instead of collaborating for the good of the business, which leads to siloed decisions. Something might make sense for the bottom line in one division, but it's counterintuitive for the business as a whole, like letting one team stack up design debt even though it's jamming the support team full of queries. Every division is measured as either a profit center or a cost center. And management's goal is to squeeze out just a little more revenue out of sales and marketing, and to push down costs in areas like support, tech, and operations. And you know where product and innovation sits? We're seen as a cost center. We've historically reported into a tech function whose job it was to keep an eye on costs, which basically gets us trapped in this old pattern of writing finely detailed specs, breaking them into points, and being measured on velocity, or how quickly your team can burn down that stack of points. Now, this model might control costs, but it optimizes for building features, not for solving problems. It's output focused when it should be outcome focused. All this pointsing and burning down at high velocity rarely leaves room for discovery, and instead usually leads to team burnout and all sorts of tech, design, and process debt. So you end up with organizations that are riddled with working debt, that are skipping discovery and building the wrong thing, and are setting themselves up to get disrupted. And there's a bigger cost than all that. There's a cost in the cognitive dissonance that your team feels when they know they're being dragged down by debt and this constant short-term mindset. This cost accrues as your culture debt. It results in storming as well. Remember I talked about trust and incentives earlier? Well, one of the biggest causes of tension in a team looks exactly like this. So you've got someone on the tech side and someone on the business side, and they end up in a fight over a deadline or a project. They're not fighting because of personal tensions. They're disagreeing over the outcome of the project because it's asking them both to work counter to what they've been incentivized to do. The developer is usually the one advocating for quality, and the business person is usually the one who just wants it done on time. They're both being pressured to give a little or sometimes a lot, depending on whether it's an engineering-led organization or a sales-led one. Oh, and the product manager is always stuck right in the middle, arbitrating the whole thing. What's missing is a shared vocabulary and trust where they can talk about their incentives honestly and talk about the trade-offs they are and aren't willing to make and how they impact the business. Over the course of these conversations, each gives a little and a common ground is found. And a compromise is delivered that works for both people and the business. Like, for example, an agreement on a time-limited experiment with permission to go back and refactor afterwards. Or perhaps an agreement to get the developer involved earlier next time so that misunderstandings are actually avoided the next time that this happens. This is where cross-team collaboration, transparency, and psychological safety come in to save the day. Any company needs to make it a priority, as in company level objectives, to address debt, to have measures in place to understand and communicate debt, as well as provide means for people to easily spot and speak out if they see debt being incurred without a cohesive plan. Now, some of you might work for wonderful companies that already have this sorted out. Some of you might be nodding along and furiously taking notes. Doubtless, I've just added a number of things to your to-do list for tomorrow and beyond, and we've hardly started talking. So before we go, I'm just going to address a final type of debt that you actually have direct control over, and that is admin debt. As product people, we're knowledge workers. We work with our minds and our sticky notes and our meetings. Pretty much everyone we work with in our tech circles are knowledge workers too. Coders are coding, marketers are marketing, salespeople are selling. We spend our time doing what it says in our title and in our job description, and yet there's so much more to our work than that. Admin debt is the cost of all those little non-work tasks that pile up, like sorting through emails, organizing files, keeping laptops up to date, transcribing notes and post-its into actionable tasks, or whatever keeps you busy between the stuff you actually report in your daily stand-up. You can't be as creative and effective when you've got a lot of admin debt. To cope with admin debt, treat yourself to tidy up time. On our team, we've set it as a 2-hour block of time at the end of each working week that everyone in the company participates in. It's used for tidying up desks, getting to inbox 0 and setting filters so we can stay there, setting up automations to smooth out our workflows for next week, consolidating to-do lists, or whatever's needed so we can all have a relaxing weekend and come back on Monday with fresh, creative minds. Time paying down tech debt is always worth spending. Debt is a reality of our lives. You won't be able to build the best products by avoiding debt altogether, and you won't be able to build a healthy business or mindset by letting it stack up. Oftentimes, it becomes a little less scary when you talk about it, when you and those around you have a shared vocabulary for it, and when you have a way of measuring and taking action on it. So I hope I've given you a few new ways to think about how decisions and debts interplay, and in fact, can be used to your advantage when you step back and take a look at the bigger picture. I may have also left you with questions, as I know there's so much more to becoming outcome-led and ditching deadlines and making the best decisions as a product person. You've certainly come to the right place. So hopefully today was useful. So I've included some extra links, so some extra resources for you that hopefully will help you on your journey. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Janna. I think I'm going to start off with a couple of questions. There were like 3 types of debts you had mentioned, tech, design, and admin. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about design debt.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So design debt is similar to tech debt, but it's the one that is related to things that are going wrong in your product that are, they're things that may have been spec'd that way. They may be things that are, they were technically done correctly, but they are UX bugs, right? The UX is not quite right. You've got pieces of the app that just don't sit together right. It's not necessarily that it's a bug. You wouldn't necessarily put it through as a bug or anything like that, but it's something that is holding back the usability of your app. And so it's holding you back from being able to create the optimum customer journey, the optimum experience for your customers. So I talked today about tech debt, design debt, process debt, culture debt, and admin debt. And there are other types of debt as well, depending on how you want to define them all. But those were the 5 that I thought were most relevant to product managers.
Cool. Thank you. I hadn't quite understood what design debt was, but I think that's
okay,
really
great.
clear. Yeah. If anyone else in the audience has questions for Janna, now is your time. Feel free to unmute yourself and shoot your question.
Hey, my name is George. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, George.
Hi. So I had a question. So how, like, because you talked about like sort of ditching timelines and roadmaps, and how are you able now to like prevent like a product or a feature from being delayed or going way over time? Because if you could explain that a bit, it would help.
Yeah.
Should I ask you all the questions and then answer them, or
I'll tackle that question first because that's a big question. So when it comes to something, when you're worried about something going over time, the best way to prevent that is to make sure that you've broken it down into small enough pieces and have a clear understanding as to what problem it's meant to solve, as in what done is meant to be, so that everyone knows that, go off and solve this small piece of it and then come back when you've actually solved this particular piece, and make sure that you've got good increments in between, right? Usually teams use something like 2-week sprints to check in and make sure that you don't have somebody going off into a rabbit hole. Because the last thing you want is somebody going, oh, well, I thought you meant that we needed to solve, with some really fancy algorithm that's going to take me 6 months to develop, when instead you would have been happy with, a 2-step decision tree. And so making sure that people aren't getting lost in the weeds, having those conversations to make sure that they're not over engineering it, and that you break it up into small pieces, saying, hey, if we're looking for this, just go off and build this small piece of it, and that way you don't get lost in it. I think a lot of people get really worried about the idea of deadlines, and if you don't give a deadline, then things won't get done. But it's actually the opposite is true. If you give deadlines, what tends to happen is that you'll end up with people giving buffer. They'll make up how long they think it's going to be. But what then happens is that things end up taking longer, right? Parkinson's law happens. And so work always ends up taking as long as you said anyways. So no matter how long you said, you're always going to be nearly late on it anyways. And the quality is going to suffer because you always end up cutting it off arbitrarily. So the difference is if somebody says, oh, I think I need an extra week on this. If you tell them no, you have to give me whatever you have today, the quality is going to be that much lower. If you tell them, actually, yeah, you know what, instead of getting it out on Friday, you can get it out on Wednesday next week, the quality is going to be that much better. They're going to make sure that it's code commented, it's going to be documented, it's going to, make sure there's no to-dos left in the code. And that way, next time you want to build on top of that piece, it's not crumbly code, it's good quality. And that means that the next piece that you build on top can be built faster because whoever's working on it has everything that they need as well.
Yeah, that's a bit clear. Also, the other question was it's sort of similar to that. Are you able to convince like sort of like the stakeholders? Because I'm asking because I do work. I'm not a product manager, but I'm a UI UX designer. So I end up like working with a lot of like freelance, sort of like freelance gigs. So how are you able to convince like sort of like the stakeholder, like you're not going to use like a timeline or a roadmap, you just be delivering. Yeah, because I find it might be a bit difficult doing that, because
Yeah.
they want it at a certain, because they're actually paying you by the hour. So
Yeah.
they would want the product delivered at
So
a certain point.
So the way to handle that, this article right here includes all of the different objections that you might run into. The key thing when somebody wants a deadline on something, if somebody's saying, I want this by X, is to figure out why. Find out what the driving reasons are, because sometimes they've got a good reason for it, and sometimes they've got a bad reason for it. A good reason for having a deadline is if it's externally driven, if it's strategically important, right? As in, if you don't do this, then the business will measurably suffer. If it's like, there's a regulatory thing coming through, at which point the business needs to realize that they're operating in a space where there's regulations, and the team, they need to be able to support the team by giving enough project management time ahead of time, right? So for anything that requires that additional time, they need to give you time to do so. Therefore, you need to be able to build in that buffer. The problem comes is if you've got deadlines on everything, because if you miss one deadline, you then miss the next deadline, you then miss the next deadline, and your quality gets worse and worse and worse, and your team gets more and more and more stressed, and you end up in a really, really bad state. Occasional deadlines, if they are important to the business and they are outside driven. We don't live in la la land. Sometimes there are deadlines, and sometimes there are good reasons. Most deadlines are not there for good reasons, though. a timeline roadmap, for example, is usually there just to make the boss feel like they have a sense of control, because they love seeing a bunch of deadlines. They love seeing you say, yes, here's when I'm going to have everything done, because they get to pat you on the head and say, great, go do now. And now it's on you. They've absolved all responsibility, and you have to go deliver. And if you don't do it, you're the one in trouble, not them. And it's setting up teams for failure. So what should be happening is making sure that you're not setting arbitrary deadlines for things that are not outside driven. Because if you've got a boss giving you deadlines because I think it's going to make you work faster, that is patently not true. Having a deadline, somebody just saying, have this by Tuesday, does not make you work faster or harder or better. As a matter of fact, it demotivates, it causes people to work under stress, it causes people to make worse quality stuff. And it usually looks like they've done something, right? That team will deliver something, it'll check all the little boxes, but in reality, the quality will suffer, and they'll end up with code that just needs to be rewritten. So it's not good for their particular for the business. So find out why they need those deadlines. And, if they're doing it because they think it's going to make you, if it's going to motivate you, then push back on that and say, well, no, what I'll do is, tell me what problem you want me to solve, right? Tell me the project. You want me to make your homepage, make your website attract this many more people and make it that much better? Great, that sounds like a project. This is the type of thing that I can do. I'll spend a bunch of time on this. Let me spend the next month on it, and I'll run a bunch of experiments. I won't tell you what day those experiments are going to come out or how many experiments I'm going to run, because I don't know that. What I do know is that I can spend a bunch of time working on fixing it. That's what you can sort of do, is turn it around on what sort of problems you're going to solve, rather than exact time that it's going to take you to do any one particular task.
Yeah, that's very clear, and actually it's really a good answer, because you asked, I think asking why they actually want the deadline would actually help. And the last question is, could you explain more about using design systems, to prevent to prevent design depths or something?
Yeah, design systems to prevent design debt. So where a design system comes in, it's almost like having a set of templates, so that whenever you want to spin up a new experiment, you can easily do so without having to recreate the recreate something from scratch, right? So basically what's happening is if you were wanting to experiment really quickly on something, if somebody said, for the next quarter, we want to get our revenue from here to here, right? That's our goal. Or user growth. We want to get our user growth from here to here. That's our goal. What you would say is, well, we're going to run as many experiments as possible. And maybe in your mind, you want to run 30 experiments, right? So see if you can run 30 experiments in that time. If you didn't have a design system, if you didn't have the tools and support to do so, you would end up having to design each of those experiments from scratch, right? You'd have to be like, oh, well, I've kind of got the, the scratchings, the basic stuff that I've got here. But when it comes to actually putting something in front of customers to have them use it, you then have to get a designer to make it look good because, obviously you can't test, you can't put these things live or, get actual traffic on something if it's still a sketch drawing or if it's still, a napkin drawing. So if you have a design system, it cuts down the time that you have to put into experiments, meaning you can run more experiments, meaning chances are you're able to increase those numbers. So it's all about decreasing the amount of time so that you don't have to make as much trade-off on scope down the line or quality down the line.
Thank you. That was it.
Cool. All right. Wonderful. Good questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else with more questions for Janna? Going once.
Well, if anybody does have questions, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm really easy to find there. Come find me on Twitter. Find me on the Mind the Product Slack group. Reach out to me, and I'd always be happy to chat.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Janna, for this presentation. I've already downloaded my copy. We'll be definitely going through it, and then I'll definitely reach out to you for more questions.
Okay, wonderful.
All right, great. Thanks for everyone else who joined us. I guess we shall see you all in the next Product Tank webinar in November. Right.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.